I've just clicked record, so that's just so we can share if there's anything that you miss or people aren't able to attend today, and that will be uploaded on our YouTube channel and I think added to our website as well. So is now a good time to get started? I guess people are still kind of filtering in. Maybe we'll give them a couple more minutes. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's great to see many of you here. My name is Lisa Cameron, and I'm Executive Director of the Halifax Workers Action Center. Welcome to our Prisons Don't Work, Prisoners Do webinar, which is a collaboration between the Halifax Workers Action Center and the East Coast Prison Justice Society. Today, we're going to learn about abolition, prisoners' rights, and why prisoner labor and their struggle to unionize matters. This is a really, really interesting subject, and I've been lucky to get a bit of a sneak preview, but it's very enlightening. So I think it's a really important webinar to attend. So before we get started, I just want to take a moment to introduce today's speakers, who we're very fortunate to have. Our first speaker is Hans. Hans is entering his second year of law school at Dalhousie University. He is a graduate of the Masters of Industrial Relations program at Queen's University and hopes to practice labor and employment law. Hans spent his summer at the East Coast Prison Justice Society, where he engaged in prison justice advocacy work. He managed the phone line and spoke to people daily about concerns and issues they were having and are still currently experiencing within the prison system. And this experience that he's had has led to a firm interest in Canada's prison justice regime and the injustices within it. So welcome, Hans. Our second speaker is Aga. Aga is going into his third year of law school at Dalhousie University. He has a bachelor's degree in sociocultural anthropology from U of T, which informed his interest in social justice-oriented legal practice, specifically in the areas of labor, employment, immigration, human rights, and technology law. And Aga joined the Halifax Workers Action Center as a summer intern this year, and we've been very lucky to have him. He has dedicated much of his summer to assisting migrant workers and researching prisoners' labor rights. Sorry, I'm just admitting some more people as I speak. And upon graduating, he hopes to return to Toronto and spend quality time with his two cats and his pet turtle, Raphael. Welcome, Aga. Next, we're going to hear from Jordan. Jordan is an assistant professor of labor studies at Brock University and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism at Ontario Tech University. His research focuses on prison labor and prison worker organizing, new forms of worker organization, as well as class and the far right. And lastly, we're going to hear from Asif Rashid. Asif practices criminal, immigration, and prison law in Halifax, Quebec. He is a member of the Canadian Prison Lawyers Association and the Nova Scotia Criminal Lawyers Association. He's a former union organizer who I've had the pleasure of working alongside and is also on the board of the East Coast Prison Justice Society. So welcome, Asif. I also want to mention that Jordan and Asif co-wrote the excellent book titled Solidarity Beyond Bars, Unionizing Prison Labor, which was published in 2022 by Fernwood Publishing, and they're going to be speaking more about that today. So welcome, all of you. Again, we're very lucky to have you here. I can also just go over the agenda very quickly. If you want to move to the next slide, perfect. So we're going to get a bit of an overview of the prison system at large, look at some of the issues of prison labor, and have a discussion a bit about why the struggle to unionize is so important. And then we're going to move into a question and answer. So when we are in the Q&A period, I invite you all to ask your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. You're also welcome to include your questions like as the presentation goes along, if you like. Just keep in mind they won't be addressed until the end. And if you would like your question to be answered by a specific person, please indicate so in the chat. And just a reminder to everyone to please make sure that your microphone is muted throughout the presentation. So without any further ado, we can get started, and I'm going to pass it over to Hans.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you so much for facilitating this presentation. So as Lisa mentioned, I've been interning at the East Coast Prison Justice Society over the summer, where I've interacted directly with prisoners under the custody of Nova Scotia Correctional Services to address issues with Nova Scotia's prisons. So I figured it might make sense to start with a just brief introduction of what the East Coast Prison Justice Society does, as well as a brief overview of Canada's prison system. So the East Coast Prison Justice Society is a hub for prison justice advocacy on the East Coast, including Nova Scotia. The society works in solidarity with criminalized and imprisoned individuals across many initiatives, including by providing a centralized platform to access prison justice resources. A notable initiative is the Visiting Committee, which since the advent of COVID runs a phone line that prisoners under Nova Scotia Corrections custody can access and report concerns that they have with the prison justice system. So let's move on and provide a brief introduction to how prisons in Canada operate. So in Canada, we have provincial prisons and federal prisons. The provincial prisons are administered by the respective provincial government. So in the case of Nova Scotia, it's Nova Scotia Correctional Services, which is a branch of Nova Scotia's Department of Justice, which runs the provincial prisons. Provincial prisons house prisoners that are either serving a sentence of less than 2 years or are placed in remand. It's worth noting that prisoners who are placed in remand haven't been convicted of an offense and are presumed innocent, and yet they make up roughly 68% of Nova Scotia's prison population as of 2022. At the federal level, prisons, penitentiaries are overseen by Correctional Service Canada, which is a federal government agency. And this houses prisoners serving a sentence of 2 years or more. So while running the phone line, I thought it would make sense to identify some of the key issues that callers consistently have raised over the phone line to give a picture of the challenges that prisoners face on a day-to-day basis. So by far, the biggest issues that we've heard on the phone line concerns the repeated use of lockdowns by corrections. So this occurs when prisoners are confined to their cells, often for more than 22 hours a day, and this lasts for weeks at a time. Sometimes they're confined to their cells. They don't even have 2 hours or less than 2 hours of out of cell time. They're confined for 24 hours a day, and this can repeat for several days at a time. We consistently hear how this practice has had a profound debilitating effect on the mental health of prisoners. Many callers report experiencing severe psychological distress as a result of these repeated lockdowns. And I thought it might be helpful to this quote here is from Justice Krista Brothers, admonishing this regularized practice of lockdowns. Another issue that we hear often on the phone line involves issues with healthcare delivery and medication administration. Often prisoners experience severe delays in receiving the medication that they were receiving prior to being admitted into the prison system. Often they're confused and have difficult time reaching out to healthcare professionals. And a concerning issue that we've heard from numerous callers concerns issues with lack of informed consent, particularly situations where you'll have medical staff crushing up extended release medication and providing it to prisoners, and which often deprives prisoners of the benefit of the therapeutic benefits of the medication, as well. From time to time, it might result in premature withdrawal. So that has been another serious issue that we've encountered. Poor prison conditions, another common issue. This ranges from asbestos problems to strange black liquid dropping from the ceiling of the prison, and it's causing prisoners to feel sick. Notably, there was an E. coli outbreak, or an alleged E. coli outbreak at the Northeastern Nova Scotia Correctional Facility, which was quite concerning. We heard from callers, from numerous callers of prisoners getting sick with symptoms consistent of E. coli consumption, and also of staff doing very little to support prisoners who have showed with these symptoms. Another serious issue concerns the repeated practice of solitary confinement, which occurs when prisoners are segregated from the general prison population for 22 hours or more a day. This often takes place when a prisoner is being disciplined. It also takes place when if the prisoner requests to be isolated, or if the facility staff feels that it's in their best interest for security or safety. Something that bothers me every time I deal with a situation where somebody has expressed issues with surrounding suicidality. Usually, if you are expressing suicidal ideation, they will place you into close confinement, which usually is a room that is lit with fluorescent lighting for 24 hours, and you're being watched throughout that whole time period. And personally, I just can't imagine being placed in a situation like that, especially when I'm experiencing a severe mental health crisis on top of it. So yeah, this is just a snapshot of the issues that we've encountered on the phone line. And we're just scratching the surface here. There are so many issues, ranging from racism, gender discrimination, mistreatment by staff, conflict of interest issues. There are so many things. And yeah, so what does this have to do with prison labor? Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if someone had a question or, yeah, so what does this have to do with prison labor? Well, incarcerated workers are captive and coerced workers. They live and work in the same facility. And as we will see, the above problems are intimately tied to prison labor, including the ability to exercise leverage and grant concessions from corrections in the form of a well-organized strike. So before we get into that, though, I thought it might be helpful to briefly touch upon the accountability mechanisms that are available to prisoners when there is an issue that they face. And it's worth noting that most of these accountability mechanisms are utterly defective. In Nova Scotia, prisoners can grieve any issue relating to their conditions of confinement. But a big problem with this is that staff, we've heard from many callers that staff fail to provide prisoners with complaint forms to start the grievance process, or a regular practice of staff vetting what the nature of the complaint and determining whether it's a valid complaint before providing prisoners with a grievance form, which is contrary to corrections policy. And often these complaints are overseen by staff. We've heard of numerous conflict of interest issues, including staff investigating their superiors, and issues like that. Related to the internal grievance system is the disciplinary adjudication system, which is also overseen by staff. So this occurs when somebody has broken a facility rule, and staff then has to determine whether they are guilty of breaching that rule. Again, it's run by staff, not an independent body, and it's been described by some, and I'm not, I wouldn't contest this as a kangaroo court, basically. And there's also Nova Scotia Health's internal complaint system, and a big issue with that is that, from what we understand, they're not obligated to communicate with prisoners. So prisoners can submit a complaint and never hear back, even though Nova Scotia Health has initiated or is looking into the complaint. Yeah, we've heard from prisoners who are waiting 3 or 4 months down from when they initially submitted a complaint, and yeah, just are completely in the dark and are often experiencing some serious healthcare issues. Oh, nope, sorry. External accountability mechanisms. So there are also external accountability mechanisms, including the ombudsperson. They're an independent. However, one concern that we've noted is that they're overstretched with resource-wise, and this makes it difficult to properly look into all complaints raised by prisoners. There is a Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. Again, we hear significant delays in process in looking into human rights complaints. Often it takes a prisoner 3 months to see a human rights officer. The court system, just like outside of the prison, it's also inaccessible, expensive. It takes time, often time that prisoners don't have. At the federal level, there is the Office of the Correctional Investigator, which does provide federally incarcerated prisoners with an additional mechanism. However, a lot of the issues noted previously also apply. And in addition to, there are also issues of administrative retaliation, such as transferring prisoners from one facility to another, and suspiciously when they're making headways through the grievance process. And as we will see, I think this raises an interesting question. Perhaps a better accountability mechanism might be a prisoners' union. So before I pass the presentation off to Aga, I just wanted to give a brief introduction to how the work programs operate in the prison system. So on the provincial level, this will vary by province, but as you can see in Nova Scotia, all prisoners are required to work or participate in a program, except where exempted by a health professional. What does a provincial work program look like? Well, we know in Ontario that our license plates are produced by prisoners. Often, though, and this applies at the federal level as well, prisoners are largely working in institutional maintenance work, which is work essential for keeping facilities operational. This includes work in the kitchen, cleaning, clerical work, all the work. A lot of the work would have to have been passed on to someone else, but prisoners are doing it for little to no pay. At the federal level, there is also CORCAN, which is a special operating agency that purports to provide vocational training to prisoners. Most workers are in institutional labor, but there are several that participate in CORCAN programs. What do CORCAN workers do? Many of the furniture that you see being used by federal departments are produced by workers. And in some cases, incarcerated workers are hired by private sector companies. A notable example is Wallace Beef, which no longer exists, but for about 3 decades, they worked with the Joyceville Institution in Kingston, Ontario, where prisoners engaged in commercial slaughter work to the benefit of Wallace Beef. With all of that, I'd like to pass the presentation on to Aga.
Thank you, Hans, and thank you, Lisa, for your earlier introductions as well. So my name is Aga. I am a summer intern with the Halifax Workers Action Center. And for those of you who are not familiar with what we do, I'll start off with a quick introduction. So what is the Halifax Workers Action Center? The Halifax Workers Action Center is a free legal information clinic serving low-wage and marginalized workers in the HRM experiencing employment law related issues such as labor standards violations and provincial human rights violations at work. The HWAC operates under a triple mandate to educate workers about their workplace rights, agitate around widespread issues of workplace injustice, and organize for fair worker protections. So as an intern, I've been assisting the HWAC through client intake over the phone, listening to workers who contact us about their issues at their workplace. With the help of Director Lisa Cameron and lawyers Jason Edwards and Katrin McPhee, I help clients by discussing their legal options to them based on their circumstances, filing complaints and claims to the Labor Standards Board, Human Rights Commission, and at small claims, and helping draft demand letters to empower workers to challenge workplace injustice that they may be experiencing. So I'm going to start off by talking about the working conditions in the Canadian prison labor regime. So to start, pay is extremely minimal, even if it's even received. Federally, the maximum pay that can be earned by working prisoners is $6.90 a day. That's according to the Office of the Correctional Investigator Annual Report of 2021-2022. Provincial pay, prison pay, on the other hand, is not centrally regulated, so it can range from no pay at all to modest incentives, though generally not exceeding federal levels. So while the costs of essentials such as food and hygiene products have gone up and even get marked up substantially higher than what the public may be paying for them, the pay received by prisoners who work have only seen cuts over time, especially after the Harper government's 2013 cuts to federal prison wages through increased room and board fees. So what are the impacts of this? This basically means that former prisoners on release have less money to establish themselves, which may have effects on recidivism, as they are then incentivized to return to informal economies that may involve criminal activity. Moreover, released prisoners often must wait at least 2 weeks before they can receive income assistance again, which means that for at least those 2 weeks, they may have no income whatsoever to start reestablishing themselves. So moving on to some of the occupational health and safety concerns faced by working prisoners. Just one slide back. There you go. Thank you. So as we mentioned before, health and safety conditions are intrinsically linked to prisoners' living conditions, as they are captive and coerced workers. For those working in institutional maintenance, which is the majority of prison laborers, this is a particularly salient point. So for example, many federal and provincial prisons still have asbestos in their facilities. Legal actions have even been brought against respective governments by prison guard unions and independent contractors for exposure to asbestos at prison sites, exposing employees and prisoners alike. Now, there have been some recourse found in civil litigation, especially for those working outside the institution. And this type of litigation is often done by public interest lawyers or through self-representation. So access to justice becomes an important concern here, as prisoners often have very limited access to legal services. However, this is clearly not a preventative measure, as it is only available once harm has already occurred. This has only been made worse in the past couple of years through the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, many working prisoners are often not provided personal protective equipment or limited amounts of it. And the closed conditions of a prison mean that the environment is ideal for spreading COVID. At the federal level, decarceration efforts to reduce spread as a result of this have either been severely delayed or completely non-existent. Provinces, however, saw more decarceration to reduce spread, with Nova Scotia being a national leader in COVID-related decarceration efforts. Next slide, please. Oh, right before. The human rights one. Yeah, there we go. So it is important to also consider some of the human rights implications and the intersectional inequities behind prison labor. So as some of us may know already, prisoners are largely represented by racial minorities and people with disabilities. This also means that there may be bias in terms of access to work. So there's a phenomenon of unequal access to prison labor. So there's inequality of who gets prison work and who actually needs the training. And if we buy into the premise that prison labor is rehabilitative and helps reintegrate back into society after release, as there's often a business-like profit motive to prison industries, jobs often go to those who already have experience instead of those who might need the experience more. What this does is that it reproduces social injustice from the outside into the prison space, and then again on the outside after release in what is essentially a vicious cycle of inequality that perpetuates itself. So what does employment status, how does employment status figure into this? So establishing employment status of working prisoners is complicated, as institutions define prison workers as participants in rehabilitative programs and cannot be considered employees. But how solid is this claim? We will try to break down some of the complexities behind prison worker employment status at both the federal and provincial levels. So under the common law, for example, employment status in a rehabilitative program can be established through the real economic benefit test. And this was established in Fenton v. British Columbia in 1991. And Fenton establishes that participation in a rehabilitative program for institutionalized individuals and employment status are not mutually exclusive. So this case hinged on whether the appellant psychiatric institution derived a real economic benefit. For example, if the institution derives a profit or saves a lot of money from institutionalized workers' labor, from having its patients participate in work programs within the institution. So 14 years prior, even in 1977, similar reasoning was applied in the Ontario Labor Board decision to certify a bargaining unit at a meatpacking center in Guelph, where prison workers worked alongside regular employees. That being said, at the federal level, prisoners have been interpreted to be excluded from certain statutory and legislative protections. For example, they've been excluded from the Public Sector Labor Relations Act, according to Jolivet v. Treasury Board in 2013. So in Jolivet, the Public Service Labor Relations Board found that public service employees must be appointed by the Treasury Board per the governing legislation. Otherwise, the ambit of the Public Service Labor Relations Act does not apply to working prisoners in federal institutions. Moreover, for public service workers, the Fenton test would not apply, as the governing legislation already defines the requirements to be considered a public service employee. Moreover, Canadian prisoners are also excluded at the federal level, are also excluded from the Canada Labor Code. And this was established in 2015 in Canadian Prisoners Labor Confederation v. Correctional Service Canada. So in this case, it was established that federal prisoners working through CORCAN were not protected under the Canada Labor Code, as CORCAN is primarily an internal agency of the Correctional Service Canada, and the Canada Labor Code primarily applies to Crown corporations and the government itself. So what does this really amount to? Basically, what this amounts to keep it simple, is a legal game of hot potato, where prisoners are denied employment status at the federal level through two separate means, where they might try to establish employment status through one avenue and be denied that way and told to go another direction, and then denied that way and told to go back. So what is the situation in Nova Scotia then? So as we've discussed, some legislation around the country explicitly states that prisoners are excluded from certain labor and health and safety legislation. For example, the Canada Health Act and the Ontario Occupational Health and Safety Act explicitly exclude prisoners from their protections. Nova Scotia's Occupational Health and Safety Act, as well as its Workers' Compensation Act, however, do not explicitly exclude incarcerated people from the definition of employee or worker like in Ontario. For example, employee in the Nova Scotia Labor Standards Code is simply defined as someone employed to do work. And the definition of employer under the Nova Scotia Labor Standards Code is given a very broad and somewhat convolutedly worded definition that also could theoretically put them within its definition. So theoretically, it is possible for provincial prisoners in Nova Scotia working in prisons and in private contracts through penitentiary institutions to establish their employment status and thus potentially unionize as well to bargain for better work and living conditions. And with that, I'll hand it off to our next speaker.
Just get myself off mute. Okay, thanks, Aga. And before I start, I just want to say thanks to Lisa and also Hans and everybody at Halifax Worker Action Center and East Coast Prison Justice Society for having us today and putting this event together. I want to talk about a couple things. I'm going to give, the slide is up. I want to just say a couple other criticisms of Canadian prison labor that haven't already been covered. And then I want to talk a bit about some of the alternatives that have been proposed to the existing kind of prison labor regime in Canada and other places before talking about why Asif and I make this case for a prisoners union. And then I'm going to turn it over to him to talk a bit more about some of the barriers, but also the potential paths to prisoner unionization. So with that said, very quickly, prison labor in Canada, both the federal and provincial governments, has been broadly criticized for its inability and basically the unwillingness of the architects of these schemes to match labor market needs with the skills being offered to prisoners. So this means that one might expect that if we accept the premise that people in prison need skills training, and that skills training should translate into work once they are released, you might think that there is some effort to make sure that the work that people are doing in prison makes them marketable once they are released. And that is overwhelmingly not the case. And so we could see, for example, the federal prison farms being a very good example, or the textile industries, which Corcan runs, where there's not really that much work in Canada in agriculture or textiles, and whatever kinds of maybe more desired skills don't tend to be offered. In addition to this, there's a whole problem of outmoded technologies, and I use the examples of textiles, kind of whole industries where the kind of the labor process, the equipment that prisoners are using in prison doesn't actually look anything like what they might find in private industry. And then I just want to quickly say something about some criticisms of the gender and racial character of some prison labor programs. I'm talking mostly about the federal system here, although some of this does apply provincially as well. But for decades, Corcan in particular at the federal level has been criticized for its basically gender stereotyping. The type of programming available to women is the kind of work which has historically been understood to be women's work, like sewing and textile manufacturing, whereas men find many more opportunities in general and in the kinds of jobs which we are stereotypically associated with men, like construction or manufacturing. And there is also this particular issue which has arisen in the last few years, which is in response to initiatives by Correctional Service of Canada generally at the federal level to respond to the need for increased culturally specific programming, which is in response to the demographic makeup of the Canadian prison population, which we already heard a bit about. Corcan introduced this program called a Fur and Shirling program, which is specifically for Indigenous prisoners, and those Indigenous prisoners produce what are called and marketed as traditional Indigenous handicrafts. And this has been widely criticized as a form of cultural appropriation or exploitation, and very misguided because you get, for example, Indigenous people with no relationship to the kinds of objects that they're creating, which are like moccasins, dream catchers, these kinds of things, which might have nothing to do with their specific nation or cultural background. So I just wanted to mention these things. If we could go to the next slide. I also want to talk about a bigger issue with Canadian prison industry. And so we already heard there's basically two main types of prison labor programming: institutional maintenance and prison industry. And because of historical struggle and the desire by both labor and employers to kind of limit the ability of prison administrators to sell prison-made goods on the open market, Canada, like many jurisdictions, has something called a state use system, where the vast majority of what is produced, the goods and services in Canadian prison industries, are consumed by the government itself, mostly the correctional service itself. And in prison industries, typically have dual mandates. One is to provide rehabilitative programming, in the words of corrections, but the other is profit seeking, or at least revenue maximization. And many people, including myself, I've written on this, have pointed out the inherent contradiction in these two missions, right? So a main way that many employers try to maximize economic efficiency is by reducing labor costs, by introducing labor-saving technology and these kinds of things. But if prison administrators do this, then they can undermine their ability to offer the amount of work which they need to do. So I also just wanted to put out there this kind of problem. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so I want to talk about very quickly again a few alternatives that have been proposed to existing prison labor programs before I talk about the one that Asif and I advocate for, which is unionization. But I do want to say that there is, when we're talking about prison labor, we should understand it as a somewhat complex thing. On the one hand, prisoners do want work, and they need work for reasons of income, also for reasons of being able to get early release by showing to a parole board that they are, engaged and meaningfully rehabilitating themselves. But also, I think, prisoners want work for the reasons that lots of people want work, which is it helps to pass the time, meaning can be derived from it. And so it's important to say that prisoners do want work, but also they overwhelmingly want work which they receive some benefit from and are not just exploited. And so with that said, here's some of the things that critics have put forward as alternatives to the existing prison labor schemes that we have. So the first is immediate abolition. This happens every time there's a media controversy around, especially a big business like Whole Foods, Victoria's Secret in the United States, which basically gets caught utilizing prison labor in their supply chains. And in response to this, there is often from, the progressive, political movement demands for those companies to drop those goods and to boycott firms that use prison labor. And sometimes this is taken even further to say that prison labor should be immediately abolished, or at least prison industries. And I think, this is a problem for all sorts of reasons, partially because prisoners do want work, and there's been a long struggle against idleness by prisoners throughout the history of the penitentiary, as well as against exploitative work. But also the fact is that even if prison industry was reduced or eliminated, this institutional maintenance that we've talked about, the cooking, cleaning, clerical work, trades work, this kind of stuff is absolutely essential to the functioning of most prisons. And so it can't be simply abolished, even if that was desirable. Next is for expanded privatization. It seems like we're headed into another phase of increased privatization. For example, there's a proposal to operate a large dairy goat operation in Kingston that would, speculation is, be oriented towards export markets, and in particular to meet increasing need for baby formula, which I guess has something to do with dairy goats. But there's problems also with increased privatization, because advocates of these policies inevitably say that they would be good without any attempt to, what Asif and I in the book called, normalize the prison labor, in the sense of removing all of those legal exclusions and lack of protections, which Hans and Aga talked about in their presentations, which would simply mean increased exploitation of prison labor for the benefit of private entities. Something which is, frankly, in my opinion, more interesting, and there is an interesting history of this and examples around the world, is calls for prisoner co-ops. And sometimes this is related to other forms of small businesses. And there are examples of prisoners co-ops, especially in Europe and South America and Asia. And these are basically prisoner-run businesses. They are typically labor-intensive and not capital-intensive because prisoners don't have a lot of money, and it's hard to get investment for these kind of things, as you can imagine. So it tends to be like producing art, handicrafts, these kinds of things. And there are some very interesting historical examples. If you're interested in this, Asif and I in the book have a little section where we talk about this initiative in Canada called the Native Extraordinary Line of Furniture, which was an Indigenous run furniture making cooperative.
Yeah, I mean, it took me the longest time to figure out how to get on it.
Okay,
people
on it now. Sorry, whoever that is, would you mind muting yourself? And so cooperatives
Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, Jordan, I accidentally muted you. I meant to.
No problem. I think
not
I'm
do
back.
that. Yes, just start your sentence again, please.
Start my sentence again. I was saying something about prisoner co-ops, and I'm not exactly sure where I just left off, but some of the issues with them are that there's major issues of red tape and institutional disruption, and around things like we heard about lockdowns. These things do not tend to be well supported by administration. Am I muted or back? I'm back. Okay, so prisoners unions, co-ops. In the most successful examples, they also tend to face a problem of, as they grow, they require more support from non-incarcerated people, and the control over the business tends to shift to non-prisoners. And unlike unions, which I'm about to talk about, prisoner co-ops don't offer prisoners meaningful leverage vis-a-vis the prison administration. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so prisoners unions. As I've kind of already said, hopefully, prison labor is a multifaceted thing. It is a form of oppression and degradation and all sorts of other things that prisoners experience, but it is also a source of power. And the idea of prisoners unionism, Asif and I did not invent. There is a long history of this. It basically is premised on the idea that given how central prison labor is to carceral systems, prisoners can organize to leverage that economic power, especially through the strike, but also by leveraging strategically the existing legal rights that workers have fought for and won in our society, and bring them into basically conflict with the authority and the prerogative that prison administrators have, and force basically some form of negotiation around prison conditions that administrators would otherwise never have to engage in. And so there's a long history of prisoner unionism, especially this emerges in the United States in the aftermath of the Attica Rebellion in New York State in 1971. And there are significant prisoner union drives in New York, North Carolina, California, and other places. In Canada, there is a significant attempt by an organization called the Prisoners Union Committee in the mid-1970s in the federal system. And then there's also one which we've already heard a bit about because of the litigation that emerged out of their drive, the Canadian Prisoners Labor Confederation, in the early 2010s. And neither of these were very successful. However, there is also a success story which we need to talk a bit about before I throw this over to Asif, which is in 1977 at the Guelph Correctional Facility, which was a provincial prison in Ontario. The Canadian Food and Allied Workers successfully unionized a mixed prisoner, non-incarcerated workforce in the prison's abattoir meatpacking operation. And they certified and formed a local of the union, Local 240. And I think I'll end just by talking about what the union was able to win for these workers. So in the collective bargaining processes that followed the unionization, prisoners won equal pay compared to their non-incarcerated co-workers. They won equal access to jobs, whereas before the union came in, prisoners were concentrated in the least skilled and least desirable jobs in the workplace. This became more equitable in the aftermath. Very significantly, prisoners won the right to run for union office and obtain temporary release passes to attend union meetings in the community that happened outside of the prison. And also very significantly, the prisoners in the Guelph Correctional Center won the right to retain their job upon release. And this is another thing. I'll just editorialize very quickly here. One would think that if the point of a program like this was to help prisoners get job skills and transition in the community, then firing them upon release would not be part of the program. But this was actually something that the union had to fight for, the ability for these incarcerated workers to be released but keep their job in the meatpacking plant. And so in the scheme of things, these are fairly modest, but I do think, and Asif and I talk a lot in the book about how there's a lot of potential around how strategic bargaining could be used to broadly impact prison conditions. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Asif.
Thanks, everybody, for all your parts and Workers' Action Center and East Coast Prison Justice putting this together. Yeah, I'm just going to run through, a lot has been covered already, so I'm going to run through a few things, probably skip through a lot of what I was intending on saying because it was so well covered already. So I'm going to get into some barriers to unionization, like what's standing in the way of prisoners actually getting this done. I'm going to go to rehabilitation, some jurisdictional issues, and prison administration. How to get over the barriers, of course, very key. There's it's always about how to win, not to how to just complain about the problems. So I'm going to go into a few pieces on that, and then why the timing might be right, like why now? Speaking of which, Jordan, the current situation, are we discussing that at all?
Yeah, I think we can say something.
Yeah, I'll say
you just have to say it now because everybody, or maybe we should wait till the end and everybody can be waiting to
exactly. No suspense. There is an active organizing campaign going on right now as we speak by federal prisoners in Quebec, which will likely expand over the course of months and years. It will be a long, long struggle, but it's a determined struggle, and we could perhaps come back to that in the questions. Okay, so back and the other point that I'm intending to talk about is really what the book is about. Yes, it's about prisoners organizing, but it's also about very key an inclusive labor movement that includes prisoners. Prisoners should not be treated as some exception, some non-human entity that the normal rules don't apply to. We talk about normalization of prisoner labor and understanding of prisoners as human beings that have rights just like everyone outside of prison. The limit that they face is that they're in prison. So first off, the rehabilitation. So the concept of rehabilitation, I've said this over and over at every presentation that we do, needs to be severely interrogated to what the hell does it actually mean? It's a deeply problematic term that is used in the criminal code as well as the correctional law at the federal and provincial level as this idea of getting better. That's why they call it the correctional system. Correctional Service of Canada, Ministry of Corrections, what have you. It's all about fixing people. But I like to say that the best starting point for understanding the concept of rehabilitation is watch The Shawshank Redemption. Go to near the end of the movie. There's a character, Red, who is old and is up before the parole board. He's kind of sick of this. He goes up before them every so often, and they always just turn him down. So he's asked, have you been rehabilitated? And he basically tells them, rehabilitated, that's a bullshit word. It means whatever you want it to mean. And that's effectively how it's used in Canadian correctional law as well. And I'll get into this. So the Corrections and Conditional Release Act has as one of its objectives, assisting the rehabilitation of offenders and their reintegration into the community as law-abiding citizens through the provision of programs in penitentiaries and the community. Okay, interesting. How? How is that actually working? Not explained. In CORCAN, on the webpage for CORCAN, it's described as, in part, a key rehabilitation program for the Correctional Service of Canada. CORCAN uses on-the-job training to help offenders develop and practice essential employment skills. Through CORCAN, offenders get value on-the-job training that prepares them for jobs and trades. Is that true? No. Year after year, the Office of the Correctional Investigator, that's the prison ombudsperson for the federal system, every year it's commented on how there's a mismatch between what prisoners are doing in prison in the so-called employment and employability programs and what actually exists outside of prison. So whatever CORCAN says about rehabilitation means you're doing the kind of work that sets you up for release when that's actually not happening. So it's really a non-starter. And in the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, one part of that act I find fascinating, particularly in relation to the book, is section on payments. If you want to look it up, it's section 78 of that act. And the Corrections and Conditional Release Act is the governing statute for all of the federal penitentiary system. And it says under section 78, payment of offenders is for the purpose of encouraging offenders to participate in programs provided by the service, or providing financial assistance to offenders to facilitate their reintegration into the community. Okay, let's start at the first one. Encouraging offenders to participate in programs. So not wages, encouragement to participate, pat on the back, good job. Here's some money just to encourage you to participate. But critically evaluate this. How does this make any sense as some kind of unique situation inside prisons, that payment is to encourage participation? In capitalist society, what is the point of wages? What are wages for? Wages are to encourage workers to come back to work the next day. It's all for encouraging participation. So the idea that that by paying offenders, they're encouraged to participate, that is somehow not wages, makes absolutely no sense. And this is why it needs to be interrogated. Does what they say inside prison by the administration, how does that work in the outside world? Is there some contradiction there? In this case, there clearly is. So they are wages, and me and Jordan are absolutely clear about that. Prisoners do work. There's ways that you can test whether it's employment. There's a definition of what is an employee. An employee is someone who is earning a wage. They're hired. They can be subject to discipline. The employer has control, and the labor that's done by the prisoner is for the benefit of the employer. And there are other aspects to the test as well, but you can say all these aspects are covered by the work prisoners do in prisons. Anything prisoners do or told to do suddenly becomes rehabilitation. Think about it. If prisoners do what they're told to do, oh, now you're being rehabilitated because we told you what to do. In the case of the work programs, you need to do the work you're assigned. Now, one thing that's important to note is that if prisoners don't do the work they're assigned to do, if they end up getting a particular job assignment, let's say they're doing a CORCAN job, a CORCAN manufacturing job, and let's say they're treated very badly. They don't want to show up because, let's say, the work site's unsafe, and that's how they're treated badly, that they're being forced to do this, and they don't feel like it's safe to keep going. What if they don't show up? What happens? Well, every prisoner the federal system has something called a correctional plan, which is essentially a plan for release, and you're expected to do your programming. And if you're not measuring well on your completion of programming, then that will count against your release readiness. So you decide that it's unsafe to go to work, you could end up in prison longer, essentially. And as far as the usefulness of what prisoners do, this is important and comes back to what Hans was talking about earlier, and Anaga at different points about like looking at what prisoners are doing and who's benefiting from the work being done. And the Office of the Correctional Investigator has commented year after year that there's a mismatch between what prisoners are doing and what they actually need to do to be prepared for release. So who benefits from that? Do prisoners actually benefit from that? You can say, well, not really. Is there a benefit that that you can extract from the work prisoners are doing? Yes. The making of the furniture, the cooking, the cleaning, the maintenance in the prisons, that helps the institutions run. So whether it's for manufacturing, for government use, or possibly for private use, or whether it's essentially reproducing the prisons benefit. The prisons benefit, or the government benefits from that. So you can measure there's a real benefit that's earned by the government. But prisoners have interrogated this concept. There's a particular prisoner that we quote in the book. His name is Ghassan Salah. He's at Bath Institution in Ontario. And he said that these programs, the employment and employability programs, are supposedly gearing prisoners up for release, do not provide any marketable and transferable skills, and are not useful to the current job market demand, and are not readily linked to formal employment. Prisoners themselves say, look, here's our experience. This doesn't work, but they're ignored. And look at the example of Ontario. What would happen if the Ontario government decided, okay, instead of the license plate plates being made by prisoners at the Central East Correctional Center in Windsor, Ontario, why don't we just shut that down and put it on the open market and have people that are not in prison make license plates? Well, they'd have to pay at least the minimum wage for that. How much would that cost? A lot more. How much is the government saving on using prisoner labor to make license plates that everyone needs? This is how you measure how the benefit is actually being extracted to the employer, and it's not a benefit to the employee, which is a prisoner. And this is what part of what ends up being important in the legal case, where in order to really win the right to unionize, you must be an employee. Like you can't be declassified from being an employee and then unionize. Same thing happens to those who are misclassified as independent contractors. They can't unionize because why? Oh, you need to be an employee to unionize. You can't be running your own business. And when it comes to prisoners, oh, well, if you're just in a rehabilitation program, in other words, this is programming for your own benefit, you're not an employee, so you can't unionize. So it is a key point that must be addressed in order to actually be able to unionize. Now, the governments always claim that prisoners are the ones benefiting from programming. Sadly enough, even the federal court has this view, because this is basically the adopted view, the assumption, I call it, of prisoners. Everything that is being done for them is for their benefit. So the federal court, the case of Guérin in 2018, this is from the federal court judge. It is the work itself which is considered to have benefits under the Act and to contribute to rehabilitation. These programs are offered to help with social reintegration. Parliament chose to encourage participation in all programs through payment at rates accepted by the Treasury Board. I do not see how payment as encouragement to participate in programs, including some that are not in any way associated with institutional work or the work for Corcan, could transform into remuneration for the work done. That's a pretty bad statement. And many who read that were like, yikes, that's really just cutting prisoners out, saying there's just no way that you can overcome this idea that you're being rehabilitated, because essentially you're told you're being rehabilitated. But in a future case, in the ongoing case, this point can be contested by proving the employment relationship of prisoners, by showing how the institution is gaining a benefit, by showing that not every prisoner gets a job, because not every prisoner does, that there is actual hiring that happens, showing the control of the employer, the disciplinary power of the employer, showing all these characteristics of what makes an employee outside of prison, inside of prison, and thereby you can contest this idea, which is simply just the view that has just been inherited, that prisoners are being rehabilitated because the institution says they are. And in this, it's important to note that in the Guérin case and in previous cases, that there's never really been the proper evidence introduced to prove the employment relationship, which would take a lot of looking up job postings, looking up the schedules of the employees, looking at their hours, looking at all the evidence that exists that shows that they're being employed, and that they could actually lose their jobs, because that happens. quite a bit. So I'm not really going to get too much into the jurisdiction issue because I feel like that was already covered by AGA, that really the prisoners have been cut out. There's a game of hot potato played, cases that AGA brought up showing that, oh, well, the Public Service Labor Relations Board rejects prisoners because as employees because they're not public service employees, or when they go under the Canadian Industrial Relations Board and try to apply there, oh, well, sorry, you're not a Crown Corporation employee, so you're not supposed to be here either. Why don't you try the other guys? And so this jurisdictional hot potato game is played by saying you can't apply to this board, go to that board, can't apply to that board, go to this board. So that's definitely an issue that will have to be contested as the battle continues. And I won't cover that any further. So in order to surmount the barriers, it's important that prisoners have support. They will not win without public support. They will not win without solidarity from the labor movement. They will not win in silence, because that is effectively how you get statements like the federal court has made about prisoners can't be employees because they're in a rehabilitation program, because they are. That kind of a statement exists in silence, where no one is looking. But with public support, with a lot of media coverage, with the validation of prisoners as employees through people that have a no on the issue being interviewed and discussing it and talking about it, with solidarity by the labor movement in recognizing prisoners as employees. This validation, reification of prisoners as employees will help in this understanding by everyone, including by the courts, that there is actually public support for prisoners being employees. That is crucial for prisoners to be able to win as this battle continues. And part of this process will, of course, include a lot of networking outside. Prisoners don't have the resources and capacity to network, to be able to organize nationwide campaigns. They can only do it with public support and with organizational support. So different organizations, could be union subcommittees, it could be prison justice organizations, need to help facilitate the connectivity to allow this to happen. One prison in Quebec right now, there's some organizing happening, but the plan is for it to expand across the country. And prisoners have an independent union. It's called Confederation. It's a prisoner-led union created by and for prisoners. And the current plan is that will be the union that spreads across the country. But it can only do so with public support and solidarity by the rest of the labor movement. As far as the administrative barriers, this is something that me and Jordan discuss in the book, that there have been problems in the past with guards standing in the way of prisoners when they try and organize. That's one of the biggest obstacle prisoners have is the conflict that's created between guards and prisoners, where any time prisoners organize, it's seen as a security threat. So there's efforts to try and push back against that, including when prisoners have tried to unionize. Other things that can be done by the administration, if you have somebody who's really good organizer, guess what? Transfer it out. You're going to be maxed because you're creating a security threat on the inside. You're making the institution unsafe, or you're going to go to some maximum security institution, province over, a couple of provinces over, maybe across the country. These things do happen. So for the legal case, Aga's already provided some groundwork for that. Really what needs to happen is there needs to be very clear, unequivocal identification of prisoners as employees. And despite any rehabilitative aspect to the work they do, they can still be employees, not mutually exclusive, as is pointed out in the Fenton case. And there's a bunch of other cases that have dealt with that as well. There's a number of student workers that have been successful at organizing when previously they were told you can't be employees because you're students, you're studying, you're not working. This was something that was told to postdocs. It was also told to TAs before, research assistants, other student workers that are now unionized across the country were previously told you can't do it, and then they did. And important issues came up in a number of these cases. And I won't bog you down with the details, intricacies, but the key point is that you can be both. You can be both one and another. You can be both a student transfer that to prisoners. You can be both in a rehabilitation program and be employed. There's absolutely no reason why you can't be. And it already happened in the Guelph case in any case. That exact reasoning has already played out. So prisoners will have to assert their rights under Section 2D of the Charter. That's the right to freedom of association. And this has not really been done in any fulsome way since the advent of some key Supreme Court of Canada cases over the last several years. Particularly in 2015, there was like an important case on the right to strike, the right to union of your choice, and the right to not having changes made unilaterally, but at the bargaining table. So there's been an advance in labor rights that should be helpful for prisoners as well, that really go towards the idea of inclusion, making sure that there isn't a regime where there's an under-inclusiveness of the right to freedom of association. In other words, cutting certain workers out like prisoners. So I won't bog you down with details of those cases. I will go to the one particular case though that I think is useful. That there's a case in the 1998 Supreme Court of Canada, Rizzo Shoes, RIZZO, and what that case conferred was that employee status provides basic minimum rights, and without that, you have a lot of workers who would be vulnerable. So what came out of this case, among a number of other concepts, this is common to the Supreme Court of Canada case, is that if there's an issue of vulnerability at play, then benefit of the doubt should go to defining these workers as employees, because that will confer minimum standards because of the vulnerability. Are prisoners vulnerable? Hell yeah, of course they're vulnerable, because losing your job in prison or getting a poor work performance could mean you're actually incarcerated for longer, which means you're denied your liberty. That's a huge vulnerability. How else are they vulnerable? Well, their wages suck. And for the last 40 years, they haven't seen a single cent increase. In fact, they've suffered a 30% decrease with the wage cuts in 2013. But for 40 years, that wage has remained constant, minus, of course, that wage cut. Meanwhile, the cost of prison goods has gone up 700% over that same course of time. So the cost of canteen goods, cleaning products, as well as additional food that you need beyond the minimal amount you get in your 3 square meals. There's so many vulnerabilities around that enormous inflation that really should be a driving force for the absolute necessity of an increase in wages. They're super vulnerable that they absolutely cannot fight to win what they need without being unionized, because they're flatly ignored. They've been ignored for 40 years. There's the health and safety issues that have been brought up as well. It's unsafe, unhealthy work environments, dealing with asbestos and other things that people on the outside generally don't have to deal with. Another vulnerability. The more you look at it, the more you see more and more vulnerabilities. There's also certain prisoners who are Black and Indigenous. A very high number of these prisoners are identified as being part of something called a security threat group, which means, in common speak, gang. And if you're considered part of a gang, then you will likely not be able to get one of the better jobs, which secure you more for release, or maybe you will get no job at all, which often happens. So there's another vulnerability. There should be protections against that, because it affects you whether you're going to be released or not. So whether the timing is ripe now, I think it's important to emphasize that absolutely is. There's been a lot of precarious workers that have successfully organized. The food delivery workers have successfully organized. Other gig economy workers are successfully organizing. There's a huge Amazon campaign. Yeah, it's in the US, but against the odds, they won. There's also improved, I think, support by broader society for certain groups of prisoners, at least. Like there's an increased awareness of rights for Black and Indigenous people in the fight for Black lives, justice for Black lives and Indigenous lives. Call it Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, whatever you want to call it. But that is an increased resonance in society that does relate a lot to people in prison because of the predominantly high numbers of people from those groups in prison. There are aspects to this increasing social movement activity that can help support campaigns for prisoners' labor rights. And bottom line is, prisoners need to be included in future campaigns by labor or by labor showing solidarity for existing independent prison unions for an inclusive labor movement. Labor movement's in a bit of a crisis, and there is an absolute need to focus on resources on precarious worker organizing, which includes prisoners. Yeah. Sorry, I went longer than I thought. I'm done.
Wow, thank you so much, all of you. I think the presentation has been both enlightening and very disturbing at the same time. I think, like as you were all speaking, I was sort of thinking that the content being so shocking alone is a concern. I don't know how much knowledge our attendees arrived with, but I think the widespread public ignorance speaks for itself. This information is obviously being concealed, and just a very, I don't know, maybe relatively insignificant anecdote, but while I was looking for photos to include on the PowerPoint, there were very, very few. So I do think that this is something that is being concealed a lot, because I do believe that a lot of people would be very outraged if they'd all sat here and listened to this. So I think you did a really great job. Thanks for your research, for your work, and for speaking today. Just a reminder to ask your questions in the chat. I did have one. It came to me as a private message. So let me just find that first. Yes. Meg asks, is there an argument that could be made that the legislation intentionally did not define prisoners as employees in order to prevent unionization, maybe a rights-based discrimination argument? So I don't know who wants to answer that.
Sure, I could go. And that's important. And any kind of arbitrary exclusion can be used as the basis of a human rights-based argument, which of course, that's what the charter is. Like the Section 2D of the Charter, freedom of association, that has been come to be defined with the right to unionize. That's like one of the rights that exists through that section of the Charter. But all in all, it's part of a broader human rights argument. So any human right is supposed to be inclusive as possible. So if there's arbitrary exclusions of prisoners because they're prisoners and there's no actual justifiable reason to define them out, like to simply exclude them legislatively, then that would be an arbitrary exclusion. You could say that's a human rights violation, and it would be probably most sensibly run as part of the broader charter argument for freedom of association.
Excellent. I have a question that I can answer. Council Campbell Williams asks, will this be shared? The answer is yes. I have a recording and that will be shared on our YouTube channel. And I'll also share that with East Coast Prison Justice Society if they have their own platform they'd like to share it on. We have a lot of thank yous to all of you. Any other questions for any of our excellent speakers? I would like to ask a question. I was really curious. This is an Asif and Jordan question, I think, but in your research, how much resistance did you have? Like how difficult has it been to get information? What kind of resistance have you been met with? I assume that there's been some. Just really curious to hear if there's been any pushback from within.
Yeah, maybe I can start. Yeah, getting information is painfully difficult. I think you've got the normal opaqueness of government institution, and then you've got, especially when dealing with prison industries, this whole smoke screen of like trade secrets that's used very broadly. And so Asif and I did some freedom of information requests as part of the book. Very long process, very difficult. And yeah, that it's an ongoing struggle. I think anybody who does prison research will tell you about the difficulties. This is also related to just the issue of censorship, which is a major issue that prisoners face and is a major barrier to prison organizing. So to give a little anecdote about us in the book, we had some requests from people we were in contact with inside, and we were just mailing them in. There's different kinds of rules around what kind of material can be mailed into prisons, but after a few books, they stopped getting in, and we never really got to the bottom of what it is. But we assume that the book is deemed to be undesirable from whoever is overseeing the mail rooms.
I did get a few books in, and I think they realized what was happening. And then when I tried to send some more books, I was told, oh, there's a particular procedure for bringing books into prisons. You need to follow the correct procedure. This is after some books already got in without a problem. So, you can also interrogate that about what is actually a procedure and what is just something they discretionarily put in place in order to prevent. I mean, the issue they raise is, oh, you're bringing in contraband. That's the blanket excuse. And to be fair, there is contraband that comes into prisons. Absolutely. Prisoners try to get stuff inside all the time. But is that really the reason they're denying the book from coming in, especially one about prisoners unionizing? I don't think so.
Leslie asks, could you share more about the Quebec case?
I feel like we can't say too much because of the sensitive nature of it. But I think what we can say is that, yeah, as Asif said, Confederation, also known as the Canadian Prisoners Labor Confederation, which we saw in some of the earlier presentation with their earlier court cases that resulted from their activity, has reinitiated an organizing campaign and is currently in the process of filing a unfair labor complaint on the basis that they requested the ability of their organizers to move through an institution in order to sign union cards. And that's where things are at right now. That's the basis of the case. What this means for people who support this kind of thing, I think it's a bit early to say. And Asif and I are in touch with organizers, but very much trying to take their lead on, what exactly details are being released at this point. I don't know, Asif, is there anything more to say?
Yeah, we're just really obviously being very respectful of the organizers. They're at the center of this, and want to make sure we're getting the green lights for how much information to convey. But the idea is at some point it will be broadly revealed to like everywhere, basically. But just waiting for go ahead to provide more details, like whatever we may have. It's in an early stage right now in any case, so that's what we can say.
Someone had asked how to support incarcerated workers, and Asif has replied, you can send me an email, Asif at asifrashidlaw.ca. As things develop with the campaign, there will be more ways to support that will be relayed.
Can I follow up on that?
Yes.
I think given what some of the stuff that Asa said about the role of the labor movement, I think if you are a union member, something that people can do is start talking about this, to your coworkers, to people in your union local, and at some point there will have to be, I think, the question will be called on whether or not labor is gonna step up and support this kind of campaign. And it's going to take people, pushing their local executives and pushing their parent unions to hopefully take up the cause of incarcerated workers.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Antonia asks, did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission address anything related to incarcerated Indigenous people, I guess, and their labor conditions?
Not to my knowledge. No, not to my knowledge, it did not.
No, that issue has not been addressed yet. But anything like that is very useful to just provide more pressure, to basically provide more substance to arguments of the vulnerability of prisoner workers, for the sake of any doubt leading to their definition as an employee, and things like the necessity of Indigenous people not being subjected to further punishment and genocide as through the residential schools. And prisons have been recognized as the new residential schools by the Supreme Court of Canada since 2000, since a case that was called Guadu, which is standing for the position that efforts must be made to avoid over-incarceration of Indigenous people. Of course, the case has been widely ignored in practice for Indigenous people's incarceration is going up. And of course, so many people in prison work, so you end up with this disproportionately high number of Indigenous people subjected of prisoner labor. So is there a way to bring in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations into that? There probably is. Somebody just has to make the argument.
I also included the link to Fernwood Publishing's where you can purchase the book. It's excellent. I have it, and I highly recommend you get it yourselves. And yeah, there's the link. Is there anything else to discuss? I know that you've all spoken at length and in great detail about a very important subject, and so if is there anything else that you'd like to highlight before we wrap up? Or again, are there any other questions that our speakers can answer? Okay, well, like I said, the recording will be up. There's a lot of content. I might go back and listen to this again. So we'll definitely be posting that on our Facebook page, on our website, and on YouTube, and will probably be shared beyond just the Workers Action Center. So thank you all so much. And it's been a really great crowd, really well attended for an event on a Tuesday in the summer. So yeah, I think we can wrap up now.
Thanks, everybody.
I'll just stop the recording.